The tragic story of Jeffrey Dahmer, a tale of murder, mental illness, and systemic failures. Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, was an American serial killer and sex offender who committed the rape, murder, and dismemberment of 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. Dahmer's crimes were particularly gruesome and disturbing, as he would often engage in necrophilia and cannibalism with his victims' bodies. He also kept body parts as trophies and attempted to create zombies by drilling holes into his victims' heads in an attempt to lobotomize them. Dahmer was eventually caught in 1991 after one of his intended victims, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape and alert the police. In 1992, he was found guilty of 15 of the 17 murders and was sentenced to 15 life terms in prison. Despite his heinous crimes, Dahmer expressed remorse for his actions and was described by those who knew him as a model prisoner. He even helped other inmates with their legal cases and participated in a prison ministry. However, Dahmer's remorse did not excuse the horror of his actions, and he will forever be remembered as one of America's most notorious serial killers. His case continues to be studied by criminologists and psychologists in an attempt to understand the psyche of a serial killer. Dahmer was killed by a fellow inmate in 1994 while serving his sentence in Columbia Correctional Institution. The tragic story of Jeffrey Dahmer serves as a reminder of the darkest aspects of human nature and the need for continued efforts to understand and prevent violent crime. In addition to the crimes he committed, the investigation and trial of Jeffrey Dahmer also brought to light several failures on the part of the authorities. Despite numerous complaints and reports about Dahmer's strange behavior, he was able to continue his killing spree for over a decade. For example, in 1988, Dahmer had been arrested for indecent exposure, but he was let go with just a fine and a warning. Had the police followed up on that arrest and searched his apartment, they would have discovered evidence of his crimes. Similarly, in 1991, Dahmer had been questioned by police about the disappearances of several young men, but they did not have enough evidence to search his apartment or arrest him. Furthermore, Dahmer's victims were mostly marginalized members of society, such as homeless men and gay men, which may have contributed to their deaths being overlooked by authorities. In the aftermath of Dahmer's capture, the Milwaukee Police Department conducted an internal investigation and found that some officers had mishandled evidence, failed to follow up on leads, and ignored complaints from the community. Several officers were disciplined as a result. Furthermore, Dahmer's case also brought attention to the issue of competency to stand trial. Dahmer pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, but was found to be legally sane and therefore responsible for his actions. However, some experts argued that his severe mental illness should have made him ineligible to stand trial, and that he should have been committed to a mental institution rather than prison. In addition to the information provided previously, it is also worth noting that Jeffrey Dahmer's upbringing and childhood may have played a role in the development of his twisted desires and actions. Dahmer's parents were described as emotionally distant, and his father was an alcoholic. Dahmer himself had a history of alcohol abuse and struggled with depression and loneliness. Furthermore, Dahmer had also shown an interest in dead animals from a young age and had a history of animal cruelty. Additionally, Dahmer's trial also brought attention to the issue of media sensationalism and the impact it can have on the legal process. The trial was widely covered by the media, and Dahmer became a household name, with many sensationalizing the details of his crimes for the sake of ratings and readership. This led to a circus-like atmosphere around the trial and made it difficult for the jury to separate fact from fiction. It's also worth mentioning that Jeffrey Dahmer's case has been the subject of several books, movies, and documentaries. Some of them have been criticized for glamorizing his crimes and giving him a platform to share his twisted perspective. This is an important conversation to have about how we consume and report on true crime, and the impact it can have on the public's understanding of these cases and the victims. In conclusion, the story of Jeffrey Dahmer is a tragic and disturbing one that highlights the darkest aspects of human nature and the impact of mental illness, societal failures, and media sensationalism on criminal justice. It's important to remember the victims of his crimes and the impact that it had on their families and the community. It's also worth noting that Jeffrey Dahmer's case brought attention to the issue of race in the criminal justice system. Most of Dahmer's victims were African American, and some have argued that the authorities' lack of attention to their disappearances and deaths was due to racism and bias. Furthermore, during his trial, Dahmer's lawyers used the insanity defense to argue that he was not responsible for his actions due to his mental illness, which has been criticized for being a legal strategy that is disproportionately used for white defendants and is often successful for them. On the other hand, many of the African American community in Milwaukee felt that the justice system failed them, as Dahmer's crimes were committed in their neighborhoods but were not taken seriously until a white victim came forward. The case also highlighted the systemic issues of poverty, racism, and marginalization that many African Americans in Milwaukee faced, which contributed to the vulnerability of Dahmer's victims. It's also important to remember that Dahmer's victims were more than just statistics. They were individuals with families and friends who loved them. The impact of their deaths on those who knew them was immeasurable, and it's important to keep their memory alive and not just focus on Dahmer's crimes. In conclusion, the story of Jeffrey Dahmer is a complex and disturbing one that highlights not only the heinous acts of a serial killer, but also the shortcomings of the criminal justice system, society at large, and media in protecting vulnerable people from harm, particularly people of color. It's important to remember the victims of his crimes and the impact that it had on their families and the community.